I found my wife sleeping with her lover in the car. But what was in the trunk was disaster.
The rain was not just falling, it was punishing the earth. It hammered against the roof of my sedan like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry, a relentless rhythm that usually helped me think, but tonight, it only amplified the static in my head. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the deluge, slicing through the neon distortions of the roadside signs. I was an hour outside of Chicago, in a place where the city's meticulously planned grid dissolved into the chaotic sprawl of forgotten highways and cheap lodgings. I was an auditor. My life was defined by columns, rows, and the absolute certainty that if you looked hard enough, the numbers always told the truth. People lied. Receipts, ledgers, and bank statements did not. But tonight, I wasn't chasing a discrepancy in a corporate tax filing. I was chasing a ghost in my own marriage. My name is Arthur Miller. I deal in risk assessment. I calculate the probability of loss. And for the last 3 weeks, the probability that my wife, Jessica, was hiding something had moved from a statistical possibility to a near certainty. The GPS on my phone glowed in the darkness, a single blue dot pulsing near the edge of the screen. I had synced our cloud accounts months ago, a simple security measure she had likely forgotten, or perhaps she just didn't think I was capable of checking. People often mistook my quiet nature for blindness. They assumed that because I didn't shout, I didn't see. It was a fatal error in judgment. The Lakeside Inn sign flickered ahead, the L burnt out, leaving only Lakeside Inn glowing in a sickly yellow buzz. It was the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found, or when they couldn't afford to be seen. I pulled into the lot, killing the headlights immediately. The darkness rushed in, thick and suffocating. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath fogged the glass. I was a man of procedure, of routine. I woke up at 6. I drank black coffee. I reviewed portfolios. I came home at 7. This, sitting in a rain-slicked parking lot at 2 in the morning, was a violation of every protocol I lived by. But there it was. In the far corner, under the solitary cone of light from a flickering street lamp, sat a white Lexus. Jessica's Lexus. It was parked haphazardly, straddling the white line, a careless violation of order that irritated me almost as much as why it was there. I took a deep breath, the air in the car stale and recycled. I needed to verify. Verification was key. In my line of work, you never acted on a hunch. You acted on evidence. I opened the door and the roar of the storm swallowed me. The rain was freezing, soaking through my trench coat in seconds, plastering my hair to my forehead. I walked slowly, my shoes squelching on the oil-stained asphalt. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to get back in the car, to pretend I had never come. Ignorance is a liability, I told myself. Knowledge is an asset. I approached the Lexus from the rear. The windows were heavily tinted, opaque black squares that refused to give up their secrets. I moved to the driver's side, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wiped the rain from the glass and peered inside. The interior light was off, but the faint illumination from the street lamp filtered through. They were there. Jessica was in the passenger seat, her seat reclined all the way back. She was asleep, her mouth slightly open, a strand of blonde hair stuck to her cheek. Even in this lighting, she looked peaceful, untroubled by the gravity of what she was doing. And in the driver's seat, slumped against the window, was Brian. Brian. The star of her real estate agency. The man who wore suits that cost more than my car and smiled with too many teeth. Seeing them there, unconscious and vulnerable, I felt a surge of something hot and corrosive rise in my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound sense of waste. We had built a life. A mortgage, investments, plans for the summer. And she had traded it for a rainy night in a parking lot with a man who probably didn't know her middle name. My hand reached for the door handle. I wanted to rip it open. I wanted the cold rain to wake them. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, to see the fear in their eyes when they realized the game was over. I wanted the confrontation. I wanted the chaos. But then, my eyes drifted. Something was wrong with the silhouette of the car. The trunk. It wasn't flush with the bumper. It was popped open, just an inch or two, hovering as if the latch hadn't quite engaged. I froze. Why was the trunk open? The wind howled, pushing against my back. I stepped away from the door, my shoes sliding on the wet pavement, and moved to the rear of the vehicle. I looked around. The parking lot was empty. The motel windows were dark. We were alone in the storm. With a trembling hand, I reached under the lip of the trunk and lifted. The hydraulics hissed softly, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet night. The light from the street lamp spilled into the cargo space. I expected to see overnight bags. Maybe a bottle of wine. The clichés of an illicit affair. What I saw made the breath catch in my throat. There were no suitcases. Instead, the trunk was packed tight with 3 heavy-duty plastic storage bins. The lid of the one closest to me had been knocked askew, likely when they hit a pothole or parked too aggressively. Inside, stacked in neat, tight rows, were bundles of cash. I stared, blinking the rain out of my eyes, sure that I was hallucinating. I reached out and touched one of the bundles. It was dry, wrapped in a bank band. $100 bills. This wasn't pocket change. This was a fortune. Next to the cash, wedged between the bins, was a thick, black accordion folder. It was bulging, the elastic strap barely holding it closed. My mind shifted gears instantly. The jealous husband vanished. The auditor took over. I pulled the folder out, shielding it with my coat to keep it dry. I opened it carefully. My phone's flashlight cut through the darkness. These weren't love letters. They were ledgers. Titan Real Estate, Escrow Accounts, 2024. I flipped through the pages. My eyes scanned the columns faster than I could consciously process. Wire transfers. Offshore holding companies. Large cash withdrawals marked as renovation costs for properties that I knew, from Jessica's casual dinner complaints, were barely standing. There was a property on Elm Street listed here. A sale price of $3 million. But the withdrawal log showed $4 million leaving the account. $1 million vanished into thin air, or rather, into the plastic bin sitting in front of me. I looked back at the sleeping figures in the front seat. This wasn't just about passion. This wasn't just a midlife crisis or a lapse in judgment. This was an exit strategy. Jessica wasn't just leaving me. She and Brian were liquidating the company's assets. They were stealing from their clients, from the firm, and they were preparing to run. The realization hit me with the force of physical impact. If I woke them up now, if I screamed and shouted, what would happen? They would panic. They might drive off. Or worse, they might realize that I had seen the money. And me? What was my position? I was the husband of the perpetrator. We filed joint tax returns. Our finances were entangled. If this came out now, before I had proof, before I had separated myself from her mess, I would be dragged down with her. The authorities would look at the accountant husband and assume I was the architect of the fraud. I carefully placed the folder back exactly as I had found it. I adjusted the lid of the bin so it looked undisturbed. I pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. Click. A photo of the license plate. Click. A photo of the sleeping couple through the window, their faces clearly visible. Click. A wide shot of the trunk. Click. A close-up of the cash bundles. Click. A macro shot of the ledger page, showing the dates and the amounts. I took 20 photos in less than a minute. Every angle. Every detail. Then, I gently lowered the trunk lid. I didn't latch it. I left it exactly as it had been, hovering, a fraction of an inch from closed. A symbol of their carelessness. I walked back to my car, the water squelching in my shoes, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt a strange, icy clarity. I started the engine, kept the lights off, and reversed slowly out of the spot. I didn't look back until I was on the highway, and even then, it was only to check my mirrors. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the rhythmic slap of the wipers. I thought about the last 10 years. The dinners. The holidays. The quiet evenings on the couch. I had thought we were building a foundation. Now I realized I had been building on a sinkhole. She wasn't just betraying our vows. She was endangering my freedom. She was risking my reputation, the one thing I valued above all else. In the world of finance, reputation is currency. Without it, you are bankrupt. She had underestimated me. She saw me as boring. Predictable. Safe. She was about to learn that safe and harmless are two very different things. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The house was dark, silent, imposing. It looked like a model home, perfect and empty. I parked the car, went inside, and stripped off my wet clothes in the mudroom. I put them directly into the washing machine. I couldn't have her smelling the rain on me. I took a shower, scrubbing my skin until it was red, washing away the grime of the motel parking lot. Then I put on my pajamas and lay in bed on my side of the mattress. I didn't sleep. I watched the digital clock on the nightstand change numbers. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. 6 o'clock. At 6 a.m., the alarm buzzed. I turned it off instantly. I got up. I made coffee. I poured it into 2 mugs. I sat at the kitchen island, opened my tablet, and began to read the morning financial news. At 7:15, the front door opened. I didn't turn around. I took a sip of coffee. It was black, bitter, and hot. Arthur? Her voice was tentative. In the kitchen, I said. My voice sounded normal. It surprised even me. Jessica walked in. She looked terrible. Her clothes were rumpled. There were dark circles under her eyes. She was carrying her heels in her hand. She stopped when she saw me, bracing herself. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "God, what a night." "Coffee?" I asked, sliding the second mug across the granite countertop. She approached cautiously, like a stray animal unsure if it was about to be fed or kicked. She took the mug. "Thanks. I need this." "How was the presentation?" I asked, not looking up from my tablet. "Oh, it was long," she lied. The fluidity of it was impressive. The clients were impossible. We were at the office until past midnight, and then Sarah said I shouldn't drive home in that storm, so I just crashed on her couch. "Smart," I said. The roads were dangerous. I finally looked at her. I looked her right in the eyes. I was searching for a flicker of guilt, a hesitation. "You look tired, Jess," I said softly. "I am," she sighed, blowing on her coffee. "Just exhausted. This deal is taking everything out of me." "Well," I said, closing the cover of my tablet with a soft snap. "Hard work pays off, right? Eventually, the books have to balance." She paused, the mug halfway to her lips. For a second, just a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowed. She was wondering if there was a double meaning. "Right," she said, taking a sip. "Exactly." I stood up and straightened my tie. "I have to head in. Big day. Quarterly audits." "Okay," she said, looking relieved that the interrogation was over. "I'm going to shower and get a few hours of sleep before I go in." "Do that," I said. I walked past her, pausing at the doorway. I looked down at her feet. "Jess?" "Yeah?" "You have mud on your ankles," I said. She froze. "Must have stepped in a puddle walking to the car," I added casually. "Have a good sleep." I walked out the door, got into my car, and drove away. The moment I was out of sight of the house, my grip on the steering wheel tightened again. She was going to sleep. She was going to wash off the motel smell. She was going to think she had gotten away with it. I arrived at my office building 20 minutes later. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. The glass walls of my office overlooked the city skyline, a gray panorama under the morning clouds. I sat at my desk and connected my phone to my secure desktop terminal. I uploaded the photos. They appeared on the dual monitors in high resolution. The license plate. The faces. The money. The ledger. I zoomed in on the document. Project Horizon. That was the name on the file tab. I opened a new spreadsheet. I started typing. I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was an auditor conducting the most important investigation of my career. I pulled up the public records for Titan Real Estate. I cross-referenced the names from the ledger with shell companies registered in Delaware and the Caymans. It was sloppy. They were arrogant. They thought no one was watching. The amount of money involved was staggering. Enough to put them away for 20 years. Enough to ruin anyone associated with them. Including me. I leaned back in my chair. If I went to the police today, they would freeze the assets. They would interrogate everyone. Jessica would claim I knew. She would say I helped her structure the accounts. It would be her word against mine, and in a complex financial crime, the spouse is always the first suspect. I couldn't just report a crime. I had to prove my innocence. I had to prove that I was the one who uncovered it, not the one who benefited from it. And to do that, I needed more than photos. I needed the full trail. I needed to know when they were moving the rest of the money. I looked at the photo of Jessica sleeping in the car. She looked so innocent. "You want to play games with numbers, Jessica?" I whispered to the empty office. I opened the folder on my computer labeled Personal Finances. I wasn't going to divorce her. Not yet. Divorce was a civil matter. This was a federal matter. If she wanted to leave me, she was free to do so. But she wasn't going to leave with my dignity, and she certainly wasn't going to leave with that money. I picked up the phone and dialed my assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the morning," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I have some discrepancies I need to reconcile." I hung up and looked at the screen again. The balance sheet of our marriage was in the red. It was time to correct the error. I began to type. The days that followed were a study in duality. To the outside world, I was Arthur Miller, the diligent auditor, the quiet neighbor, the supportive husband who took out the recycling on Tuesdays and dry-cleaned his suits on Fridays. But inside the silence of my own mind, I was a man walking a tightrope over a canyon, the wind howling in my ears, every step calculated to keep me from plummeting into the abyss that my wife had carved out beneath us. I sat in my office, the hum of the climate control system the only sound in the room. The dual monitors in front of me were glowing with the secrets I had stolen from the trunk of a Lexus in a rain-slicked parking lot. I had spent the last 48 hours reconstructing the architecture of their deceit. It was, I had to admit with a grim sort of professional appreciation, a sophisticated structure. It wasn't a simple smash and grab. It was a slow siphon, a parasitic drain attached to the arteries of Titan real estate. They were moving money through a labyrinth of shell companies with names that sounded robust and reassuring: Apex Holdings, Sovereign Trust, Blue Water Capital. But when I peeled back the layers, looking past the impressive letterheads and the registered agents, I found nothing but empty rooms and P.O. boxes in tax havens where the sun shone bright and the banking laws were shadowy. I adjusted my glasses, zooming in on a transaction dated 3 weeks ago. A wire transfer for renovation materials for a commercial complex in the suburbs. The invoice listed high-grade steel and imported marble. I knew that complex. I drove past it on my way to the gym. It was a dilapidated strip mall that hadn't seen a paintbrush, let alone imported marble, in a decade. The money, nearly $200,000, had gone into an account in the Cayman Islands, and from there, it had vanished into the digital ether. Or so they thought. My job, my real job, was to find the things that people thought were gone. I traced the routing numbers. I cross-referenced the IP addresses used to access the accounts, careless, so careless, using the Wi-Fi at her favorite coffee shop. The trail didn't disappear, it just went underground. And it all led to a single accumulation point, a pot of gold at the end of a very crooked rainbow, waiting for them to collect it and disappear. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The scale of it was terrifying. This wasn't just embezzlement, it was grand larceny on a level that would attract the kind of federal attention that didn't knock on doors, but kicked them down. If I was standing next to her when that happened, if my name was on the joint tax returns that failed to declare this income, I would be collateral damage. My license would be revoked. My assets seized. My reputation, the only currency that truly mattered in my world, would be incinerated. I needed to act, but I couldn't be rash. I needed to be the ghost in their machine. That evening, the charade continued. I arrived home at exactly 7 p.m. The house was warm, smelling of roasted chicken and rosemary. It was a domestic tableau so perfect it felt like a stage set. Jessica was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables. She looked up as I entered, her smile bright, practiced. "Hey, you," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "How was the world of high finance today?" "Stable," I said, loosening my tie. "Predictable. Just the way we like it." I walked over and kissed her on the cheek. I smelled her perfume, a floral scent she had worn for years, but underneath it, I imagined I could smell the metallic tang of betrayal. I didn't recoil. I didn't flinch. I was an actor now, performing the role of the oblivious husband, the safe harbor she was planning to abandon. "Dinner is almost ready," she said, turning back to the counter. "Oh, by the way," Brian called. My heart skipped a beat, a physical reaction I suppressed instantly. I walked to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of sparkling water. "Oh?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "What did the star agent want?" "He invited us to dinner on Friday," she said, her back to me. "Just a celebration. They closed the deal on the Highland property. He thinks we should all go out. To the Summit." The Summit was the most expensive restaurant in the city, a place where the steaks cost more than my weekly grocery budget and the wine list was thicker than a phone book. It was exactly the kind of place Brian loved. It was a theater for his ego. "That sounds expensive," I said, pouring the water. "It's on the company card," she said quickly, too quickly. "Come on, Arthur. It will be fun. You need to get out more. You're always so buried in your work." I looked at her back. She was tense. Her shoulders were tight. She wanted me there. Why? To alleviate her guilt? To show off her lover in front of her husband, a twisted power play? Or was it to normalize their relationship in my eyes, to make Brian just a friend, a colleague, so I wouldn't suspect the truth? "Sure," I said. "I'll check my calendar, but I think I'm free. It might be nice to see how the other half lives." She turned around, relief washing over her face. "Great. It's a date." Friday arrived with a cold wind that rattled the windows of our bedroom. I dressed with meticulous care. I chose a charcoal suit, conservative, impeccably tailored, but understated. I wasn't going to compete with Brian on his turf. I was going to be the contrast. The gray background against his flashy neon. The restaurant was perched on the top floor of a skyscraper, offering a panoramic view of the city lights sprawling out like a grid of diamonds on black velvet. The air inside smelled of truffle oil and expensive cologne. Brian was waiting for us at a corner table, rising as we approached. He was wearing a navy suit with a sheen to it, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone to reveal a glimpse of chest hair. He looked like a man who had just won a lottery he hadn't paid to enter. "Arthur." "Jessica." He boomed, extending a hand that was manicured and warm. "So glad you could make it." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, aggressive. I kept mine limp, passive. I wanted him to underestimate me. I wanted him to feel superior. "Good to see you, Brian," I said. "Congratulations on the Highland deal. Jessica tells me it was a complex closing." "Oh, you know how it is," he said, waving a hand dismissively as we sat down. "Just moving pieces on a board. But that's why we're the best, right, Jess?" He winked at her. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of their secret. Jessica giggled, a sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. We ordered drinks. Brian ordered a bottle of Cabernet that cost $600 without looking at the price. I ordered tap water. "So, Arthur," Brian said, leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine. "How is the auditing game? Still hunting for missing pennies?" "It's necessary work," I said calmly. "You'd be surprised what people try to hide." Brian laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "I bet. But it must be dry. Looking at numbers all day. No thrill of the chase. No adrenaline." "There is a certain satisfaction in balance," I replied. "In knowing that everything is accounted for. That there are no loose ends." He looked at me over the rim of his glass, his eyes mocking. "You're a funny guy, Arthur. You live in a black and white world. But the real money? The real fun? It's in the gray areas. That's where the magic happens." I caught Jessica's eye. She looked nervous. She took a large sip of her wine. "The gray areas are where people get lost," I said softly. The conversation flowed around me, a river of self-congratulation and corporate gossip. I sat there, observing. I watched the way his foot brushed against hers under the table. I watched the way her eyes lingered on his face when he spoke. I was gathering data points. Every touch, every glance was a transaction, and I was logging them all. I excused myself to use the restroom. The bathroom was lined with marble and gold fixtures. I washed my hands, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked calm. I looked like a boring, middle-aged accountant having a boring dinner. Good. I returned to the table but stopped just before I reached them. I was out of their line of sight, hidden by a decorative pillar. "He doesn't suspect a thing," Brian was saying, his voice low. "He's a drone, Jess. He sees what he wants to see." "I just feel guilty sometimes," Jessica whispered. "Don't," Brian snapped. "He's holding you back. We deserve this. We earned this. Just stick to the plan. 3 weeks. 3 weeks." I had a timeline. I took a breath and walked back to the table, a pleasant smile plastered on my face. "Everything all right?" Brian asked. "Fine," I said. "Just checking messages. Work never sleeps." The rest of the dinner was a blur of expensive food that tasted like ash in my mouth. When the bill came, Brian snatched it up with a flourish. "On me," he declared. "Titan pays for the victors." "Thank you, Brian," I said. "You're very generous." We parted ways at the valet stand. As Brian's Porsche roared away, Jessica let out a long breath. "That was nice, wasn't it?" she asked, looking at me for validation. "Very enlightening," I said. The drive home was quiet. I needed access. I needed to know exactly where the money was going next. I had the what and the when, but I needed the where. I needed to see their communication in real time. That night, while Jessica was in the shower, I made my move. Her phone was on the nightstand. I didn't need to guess the passcode. I had seen her enter it 1,000 times. 12/12, her birthday. How original. I didn't open her messages. That would leave a read receipt. Instead, I plugged her phone into my laptop. I had prepared a cloning software earlier that day, a tool used by forensic accountants to preserve evidence. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of watching the progress bar crawl across the screen while the sound of the shower ran in the next room. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic thud that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. 90%. 95. The water turned off. 99. Complete. I unplugged the phone and placed it back on the nightstand exactly as it had been, the angle precise to the millimeter. I closed my laptop just as the bathroom door opened. Jessica walked out, wrapped in a towel, steam billowing around her. "You're still up?" she asked. "Just finishing an email," I said, my voice steady. Now I had everything. The next few days were spent mining the data I had extracted. It was a treasure trove of incrimination. Text messages. Voice memos. Photos of documents I hadn't seen in the trunk. They were planning to move the bulk of the cash, nearly $4 million, during an open house event for a luxury estate in Lake Forest. It was the perfect cover. High traffic, strangers coming and going, large bags easily explained as staging equipment. But I needed to keep them here. I needed to ensure they didn't panic and run early. I needed to make them feel safe, while simultaneously tightening the noose. Then, the variable I hadn't accounted for appeared. It was Tuesday. I came home early, a rare occurrence. I walked into the study and found Jessica standing by my desk. She was holding a piece of paper. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and accusation. It was a printout of a hotel reservation. The Grand Cayman Resort. One-way tickets. I had booked it under my name, but I had used a joint credit card. A careless mistake? No. A calculated risk. I needed to test the waters. But I hadn't expected her to check the physical mail so thoroughly. The confirmation had come in a letter, a loyalty member perk I had forgotten about. "What is this, Arthur?" she asked, her voice trembling. I froze. My mind raced. She thought I knew. She thought I was planning to leave her, or worse, that I was planning to take the money and run myself. If she panicked now, the whole house of cards would collapse. She would call Brian. They would bolt tonight. I walked into the room slowly, putting my briefcase down. "I didn't want you to see that yet," I said, keeping my tone soft, apologetic. "See what? That you're going to the Caymans? Without me? Or, with me? Arthur, what is going on?" She was projecting. She was terrified that her own plan was being mirrored. I walked up to her and gently took the paper from her shaking hands. "It was supposed to be a surprise," I said. "A surprise? For our anniversary," I lied. It was a beautiful lie. Simple. Elegant. Our anniversary was 2 months away, but I knew she had forgotten the exact date of our first date, which was coming up next week. We always celebrated the wedding, not the first date. But she wouldn't remember that right now. I looked at her, infusing my eyes with a warmth I didn't feel. "Next week marks 10 years since we first went out for coffee. Remember? The little shop on 4th Street? I thought we needed a break. Just the two of us. Away from work. Away from the stress. I wanted to take you somewhere beautiful." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. The gears in her head were grinding, trying to reconcile the terror she had felt a moment ago with the affection I was presenting now. "The Caymans?" she whispered. "I heard you mention it once," I said. "That you always wanted to go." She hadn't. She had mentioned it because that's where their bank accounts were. I was using her own slip-ups against her. She slumped into the chair, the paper fluttering to the floor. She covered her face with her hands. "Oh, my God," she sobbed. I knelt beside her. "What's wrong? You don't like it? I can cancel it." "No, no," she said, looking up, tears streaming down her face. "It's just, I'm so stressed. And you do this, you're so good to me, Arthur. And I'm just tired." I hugged her. I felt her trembling against me. It was the tremble of guilt. She was realizing that her husband was a saint, and she was a sinner. It was perfect. The guilt would paralyze her. It would make her try to be good for the next few weeks. It would keep her right where I needed her. "It's okay," I whispered, stroking her hair. "We're going to be fine. Everything is going to be taken care of." And it was. Just not the way she thought. Later that night, I lay awake while she slept beside me. Her breathing was heavy, exhausted. The crisis had been averted, twisted into an opportunity. Now she believed I was more devoted than ever. She would tell Brian that I was clueless, that I was planning a romantic getaway. They would laugh about it. They would relax. I got up and went to the kitchen. I opened my laptop. It was time to initiate the final phase. I logged into a secure portal, using a VPN that bounced my signal through 3 different countries. I wasn't sending the evidence to the local police. The local police were blunt instruments. I needed a scalpel. I navigated to the tip line for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I attached the files. The photos of the cash. The copies of the ledgers. The cloned text messages detailing the plan. The names of the shell companies. I typed a message in the description box. Subject: Massive Money Laundering and Embezzlement Scheme, Titan Real Estate. Target date for movement of funds, November 14th, location, 12, Oaks Estate, Lake Forest. The attached files contain proof of offshore evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The primary actors are Jessica Miller and Brian O'Connor. Do not approach the subjects prior to the target date. They are a flight risk. I hovered my finger over the Submit button. Once I pressed this, there was no going back. The machinery of the federal government would begin to turn. Gears would grind. Agents would be assigned. Subpoenas would be drafted. My life as I knew it would be over. The quiet dinners, the sterile house, the illusion of a marriage, all of it would be swept away. I looked at the empty kitchen. I looked at the coffee mug she had left in the sink. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cold satisfaction of a ledger finally balancing. A debit for a credit. I pressed enter. The screen flashed. Submission received. Reference hashtag 8934XB. I closed the laptop. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Jessica was overly attentive. She made pancakes. She poured my coffee. She touched my shoulder as she walked by. She was compensating, trying to alleviate the crushing weight of her own conscience by being the perfect wife for the remaining time she had left. Arthur, about the trip, she started, sitting across from me. Yes? I can't go next week, she said, biting her lip. I have that big open house at the Lake Forest estate. It's critical. Can we push it back? Maybe till after the closing? She was asking to postpone our romantic getaway so she could rob her clients and run away with her lover. The audacity was breathtaking. Of course, I said, smiling over the rim of my cup. Work comes first. We can go whenever you're ready. The tickets are flexible. She smiled, a genuine look of relief. You're the best. I promise, after this deal is done, it's just you and me. I nodded. Just you and me. I went to work. The days blurred into a countdown. I watched the calendar on my desk. November 10th, November 11th, November 12th. I monitored their texts. Brian, is he still buying the anniversary act? Jessica, yes. He's so sweet it makes me sick. I feel terrible, Brian. Brian, don't. Focus on the prize. 2 days and we're gone. Did you get the access codes for the safe? Jessica, yes. They're in my bag. I'll bring the cash to the house on Friday night. I printed the screenshot. Another nail in the coffin. On the eve of the takedown, the tension was palpable. I came home to find the house dark. Jessica wasn't there. A note on the counter. Late prep at the site. Don't wait up. Love, Jay. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. I went to my study and opened the small safe I kept behind a row of law books. Inside wasn't money, but a separate hard drive. My insurance policy. If the feds decided to turn on me, I had documented every step of my own investigation, proving I was the whistleblower, not the accomplice. I sat in the dark, listening to the silence of the house. It felt like the calm before a hurricane. I wondered if she knew, on some instinctual level, that the sky was about to fall. I wondered if she felt the eyes watching her. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. This is Miller. Mr. Miller, a voice said. Dry. Professional. This is Agent Harris. We received your packet. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice flat. I'm listening. We verified the intel. It's solid. We're moving on the target location tomorrow night. We need you to stay clear of the area. Do not engage. Do not tip them off. I understand, I said. And Mr. Miller? Yes? If you're playing us, if you're involved in this. I'm an auditor, Agent Harris, I cut him off. I don't play. I just correct errors. There was a pause. Understood. Stay by your phone. The line went dead. I sat there in the darkness for a long time. The game was set. The players were in position. The dice had been thrown. Tomorrow, my wife would lose everything. Her freedom. Her career. Her lover. And I? I would be sitting in my car, watching it happen. Not as a victim, but as the architect of her downfall. I went upstairs and packed a small bag. Not for me. For her. Just a few essentials. Toothbrush. Change of clothes. The things you need when you're being processed at a federal detention center. It was a final act of twisted kindness. Or perhaps, just one last detail to manage. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I rehearsed the end. I visualized the flashing lights. The handcuffs. The look on her face. It wasn't revenge, I told myself. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is messy. This was simply an audit. And the findings were terminal. The morning of the final day broke not with a burst of sunlight, but with a suffocating blanket of gray fog that rolled off Lake Michigan, swallowing the suburbs in a damp, opaque haze. It was fitting weather for an execution of plans. I woke before the alarm, my internal clock synchronized to the impending catastrophe. Beside me, the space in the bed was already empty. The sheets were cold. Jessica was gone, moved by the nervous energy of someone who believes they are sprinting toward freedom, unaware they are merely running laps in a cage. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the window, staring out into the white nothingness of the backyard. She was dressed in her closing day armor, a sharp black suit, heels that clicked with authority on the tile, and a heavy coat of makeup that couldn't quite conceal the tremor in her hands. She was drinking coffee as if it were oxygen, gripping the mug with white-knuckled intensity. "Early start?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. My voice was raspy, the only genuine thing about me in that moment. She jumped, spinning around, a splash of dark liquid sloshing over the rim of her cup onto her pristine sleeve. "God, Arthur," she gasped, grabbing a paper towel. "You startled me. I didn't hear you come down." "You seem on edge," I observed, walking over to the coffee pot. I poured a cup, black, no sugar. I needed the bitterness. "Is the open house really that stressful?" "It's just a property, Jess. Bricks and mortar." "It's not just a property," she snapped, scrubbing at the stain on her cuff. "It's the biggest listing of the year. Everything has to be perfect. The staging, the lighting, the atmosphere. If this goes well." She trailed off, her eyes darting to the clock on the microwave. "If this goes well, everything changes." "I'm sure it will," I said, taking a sip. "You and Brian make quite a team." She flinched at his name. It was subtle, a micro-expression of guilt that a lesser observer might have missed, but I was cataloging every twitch. "We do," she said, forcing a smile that looked painful. "He's very efficient." "I'll bet," I said. "Well, I won't keep you. I know you have a lot to prepare." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of hesitation. Was it regret? Was she looking at the husband she was about to abandon and feeling a pang of nostalgia for the stability I offered? Or was she just checking to make sure my mask was still in place, ensuring the oblivious fool was still playing his part? "Arthur," she started, her voice softening. "About next week, about the trip." "Don't worry about it," I interrupted, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Focus on today. The trip will be there when you're done. We have all the time in the world." The irony tasted metallic in my mouth. We had no time. She had hours. "Right," she whispered. She leaned in and kissed me on the cheek. Her lips were cold. "I love you, Arthur. You know that, right?" It was the final lie. The capstone on a monument of deceit. "I know," I said. "Good luck today, Jess. Break a leg." I watched her walk to the garage. I heard the Lexus start up, the engine revving a little too hard, and then the garage door rumbled shut, sealing the tomb of our marriage. I stood in the silence of the kitchen for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Then, I moved. I didn't go to the office. I called in sick, feigning a migraine. It wasn't entirely a lie, the pressure behind my eyes was intense, a physical manifestation of the mental tightrope I was walking. I spent the morning methodically erasing my presence from the shared spaces of our digital life. I cleared browser histories on the home tablet. I logged out of shared streaming accounts. I was sanitizing the crime scene before the crime had even officially happened. By noon, the fog had lifted slightly, replaced by a low, steel-gray sky that promised freezing rain. I dressed in dark clothing, jeans, a black turtleneck, a heavy wool pea coat. I wasn't dressing for work, I was dressing for a funeral. I packed a thermos of coffee and a pair of high-powered binoculars I used for birdwatching, a hobby Jessica had always found boring. "Who has the patience to stare at a tree for an hour?" she used to ask. "Me, Jessica. I have the patience." I left the house at 1 p.m. I took my second car, a nondescript sedan I used for commuting when the weather was bad. I didn't want the BMW seen near the estate. The drive to Lake Forest was a journey into the upper echelons of wealth. The houses grew larger, set further back from the road, hidden behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges that cost more to maintain than most people earned in a year. The 12 Oaks estate was the crown jewel of the neighborhood, a sprawling Georgian mansion sitting on 5 acres of prime land. It had been on the market for 6 months, empty, a hollow shell waiting for a life to fill it. Today, it would be filled, but not with a family. I didn't pull into the driveway. I drove past the main entrance, noting the Titan Real Estate, Open House signs planted in the soft earth. I continued down the winding road until I found a service lane that ran along the perimeter of the dense wooded area bordering the estate. I parked the car deep in the brush, covered it with a tarp I kept in the trunk, and proceeded on foot. The woods were damp and cold, the fallen leaves muffled my footsteps. I moved with the deliberate slowness of a hunter. I found my vantage point on a small rise overlooking the rear of the property. From here, hidden by a cluster of pine trees, I had a clear view of the back terrace, the garage access, and the large French doors that led into the ballroom. I settled in. I checked my watch. 2:30 p.m. The open house was scheduled to start at 4 o'clock, but the real activity would happen before and after. At 3 p.m., a white van arrived. Prestige Catering, the side read. I smiled grimly. There was no catering. There were no guests invited. The open house was a fabrication, a localized event for a non-existent list of VIP buyers. The van was their transport. I raised the binoculars. Brian stepped out of the driver's side. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. He looked agitated, pacing back and forth, talking on his phone. A moment later, Jessica's Lexus pulled around the circular drive. She got out, looking around nervously. They met in the middle of the driveway. No kiss. No embrace. Just a tense exchange of words. Brian pointed to the van. Jessica nodded, gesturing to the house. They were coordinating the loadout. They began to move boxes. These weren't the plastic bins from the trunk, these were staging boxes, marked kitchen and decor. But I knew the weight was wrong. I watched Brian struggle with a medium-sized box that should have contained vases or plates. He hefted it with a grunt, the veins in his neck bulging. Cash is heavy. Paper is dense. $4 million in mixed bills weighs roughly 80 pounds. They were moving the future they had stolen, box by heavy box. I sat there for hours, the cold seeping into my bones, but I didn't feel it. I was fueled by a cold, hard furnace of vindication. I watched them build their own prison. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened. The estate lights flickered on, illuminating the house like a stage. They moved inside. Through the large windows, I could see them pacing in the grand salon. They opened a bottle of champagne. They were celebrating. They thought they had done it. The van was loaded. The open house signs were being pulled up. They were preparing to leave for the airport. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A single vibration. All units in position. Hold for visual on the target vehicle leaving the garage. It was Agent Harris. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I just watched. The garage door opened. The white van backed out slowly, followed by Jessica's Lexus. They were leaving the personal car behind, taking the catering van to a private airfield where a charter plane was waiting. It was a classic move. Ditch the traceable asset, take the anonymous utility vehicle. They idled in the driveway for a moment. Brian was driving the van. Jessica was in the passenger seat. I could see her silhouette. She was probably checking her phone, maybe looking at a photo of a beach, dreaming of the sand. Then, the world exploded in light. It didn't happen with sirens. It happened with blinding, silent intensity. Floodlights from the surrounding woods, lights I hadn't even noticed being set up, snapped on, bathing the driveway in a harsh, surgical white glare. At the same time, four black SUVs erupted from the tree line, blocking the exit and the rear retreat. The van slammed on its brakes. I saw Brian jerk the wheel, but there was nowhere to go. Federal agents. Exit the vehicle. Hands where we can see them. The voice came from a loudspeaker, booming across the estate, shaking the remaining leaves from the trees. It was the voice of absolute authority. I watched through the binoculars, mesmerized. The doors of the SUVs flew open. Men and women in windbreakers with FBI and IRS emblazoned on the back swarmed the van. Weapons were drawn, not pointing to kill, but pointing to dominate. Brian froze. I could see him panic. He locked the doors. A futile gesture. An agent with a tactical glassbreaker shattered the driver's side window in one fluid motion. He reached in, unlocked the door, and dragged Brian out onto the gravel. The star agent, the man who mocked my boring life, was now face down in the dirt, his expensive slacks ruined, his hands being wrenched behind his back. Jessica was slower. She didn't fight. She sat there, frozen, her hands raised slightly, palms out. An agent opened her door. He wasn't rough, but he wasn't gentle. He pulled her out. She stumbled, her high heels twisting on the uneven ground. She fell to her knees. They cuffed her. I lowered the binoculars. The distance between us was physical, but the emotional distance was infinite. I stood up, my legs stiff from the cold. I needed to see it closer. I needed them to know. I walked down the hill, emerging from the tree line. I wasn't supposed to be there. Agent Harris had told me to stay clear. But I wasn't interfering. I was witnessing. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, just outside the perimeter of the floodlights. I leaned against a large oak tree, my hands in my pockets, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The chaos was settling into procedure. The agents were cataloging the boxes in the back of the van. One of them held up a bundle of cash, showing it to a camera for evidence. They were walking Jessica toward one of the SUVs. She looked small. Defeated. Her hair was messy, hanging in her face. She was crying, deep, heaving sobs that I couldn't hear over the wind, but I could see the way her shoulders shook. Then, she looked up. Perhaps she felt my gaze. Perhaps it was just chance. But her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the lights, searching for a lifeline, for a miracle. She saw me. I stepped slightly forward, just enough for the edge of the light to catch my face. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just stood there, a silent observer in a black coat, blending into the shadows. Her eyes went wide. She stopped walking, causing the agent holding her arm to stumble slightly. "Arthur," she mouthed. I couldn't hear it, but I saw the shape of my name on her lips. She looked at me, and then she looked at the agents, and then back at me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The surprise trip. The sudden warmth. The encouragement to focus on the closing. The privacy I had given her. It wasn't love. It was rope. And I had given her just enough to hang herself. She started to scream. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of rage, of betrayal. She lunged toward me, struggling against the cuffs, against the agent holding her. "You," she shrieked, her voice cracking, carrying over the distance. "You did this. Arthur. You knew." Brian lifted his head from the gravel, spitting dirt. He looked at me, his eyes filled with shock. The boring accountant. The drone. The man he had laughed at. I didn't say a word. I simply raised my hand in a small, polite wave. A goodbye. The agent forced Jessica into the back of the SUV. The door slammed shut, cutting off her screams. The tint of the window turned her into a shadow once more. Agent Harris walked over to me. He looked annoyed, but also impressed. "I told you to stay clear, Miller," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "I was just birdwatching," I said, gesturing to the binoculars around my neck. "Rare species in these woods." Harris looked at the van, then at me. He shook his head. "You're a cold son of a bitch, Arthur." "I'm an auditor," I corrected him. "The books have to balance." "We have everything we need," Harris said. "The cash, the ledgers, the intent. They're done. You'll need to come in for a statement tomorrow, but for tonight, go home." "Thank you, Agent." I turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't look back at the flashing lights. I didn't look back at the woman I had promised to love and cherish. That contract had been breached long ago. I was simply enforcing the penalty clause. The walk back to my car was silent. The forest felt different now. Lighter. The oppressive weight that had been sitting on my chest for weeks was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow emptiness. I drove home on autopilot. The roads were slick with the freezing rain that had finally started to fall. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, thump thump, thump thump. It sounded like a heartbeat. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. It looked abandoned. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the air, a ghost of a presence that would take time to fade. I walked into the kitchen. The coffee mug she had left that morning was still on the counter, a ring of dried brown liquid at the bottom. I picked it up. I walked to the sink and washed it. I scrubbed it until it was spotless, then I dried it and put it away in the cupboard. One less mess to clean up. I wasn't hungry, but I knew I needed to eat. Procedure. I made a sandwich, standing at the counter, eating it in small, mechanical bites. The house was silent, but it wasn't the silence of tension anymore. It was the silence of a vacuum. I went upstairs to the bedroom. Her side of the bed was still unmade from the morning. Her pajamas were on the floor where she had stepped out of them. I picked them up and put them in the hamper. I stripped the bed. I put on fresh sheets. Crisp, clean, white sheets. I took a shower, washing the smell of the woods and the grime of the stakeout from my skin. I stood under the hot water for a long time, letting it beat against my neck. When I finally lay down, it was midnight. The day was over. The account was closed. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel a surge of victory. But I didn't. I just felt tired. It was the exhaustion of a man who had carried a heavy stone for miles and finally put it down, only to realize his hands were cramped into the shape of the burden. I closed my eyes. The next few weeks would be difficult. There would be lawyers. There would be press. The scandal in suburbia. My face would be in the papers, the aggrieved husband. I would have to play the part a little longer. The shock. The devastation. But I could do it. I was good at it. And after that? I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling. After that, the numbers would be clean. The assets would be secure. My reputation would survive, bruised perhaps, but intact. I was the victim who helped the government. I was the hero of the story, not the fool. I turned off the lamp. "Good night, Jessica," I whispered into the dark. And for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. The days that followed the arrest were a blur of legal bureaucracy and public theater. The news broke the next morning. Real estate tycoon and top agent arrested in multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme. The headline screamed from every newsstand and tablet in the city. I played my role to perfection. I sat in the interrogation room at the FBI field office, looking haggard and shaken. I told them about the surprise trip. I told them how I had found the inconsistencies in our personal accounts only days ago. I let my voice crack when I mentioned the betrayal. I just wanted to take her to the Caymans for our anniversary, I told the stone-faced agents, wiping a non-existent tear from my eye. I had no idea that she was using it as an escape route. They believed me. Or at least, they couldn't prove otherwise. My digital trail was pristine. My tip to the IRS was anonymous, but my cooperation now was public. I was the cooperative spouse, the unsuspecting victim of a sociopathic wife. The asset forfeiture process began immediately. The government seized the contents of the van. They froze Titan Real Estate's accounts. But because I had come forward, because I was the whistleblower in their eyes, even if they didn't know I was the original source, my personal assets were largely shielded. The house was in my name. My retirement accounts were separate. I visited Jessica once. It was 3 weeks after the arrest. She was being held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center downtown, awaiting trial. Bail had been denied. Flight risk. The visiting room was sterile, smelling of industrial cleaner and despair. We sat on opposite sides of a thick glass partition. She looked different. The expensive makeup was gone. Her hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail. She wore an orange jumpsuit that washed out her complexion. She looked 10 years older. She picked up the phone. I did the same. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was flat, dead. "Jessica. You set me up," she said. It wasn't a question. "I audited you," I replied calmly. "You knew. That night at the motel. You were there." I was. "Why didn't you just confront me? Why didn't you just ask for a divorce?" "Because you were stealing, Jessica. You weren't just cheating on me. You were cheating the system. And you were going to leave me with the wreckage." She laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "So this is justice? Locking your wife in a cage?" "This is consequences," I said. "You made the entries. I just calculated the sum." She leaned forward, her eyes burning with hatred. "You'll never be free of this, Arthur. You think you won? You're alone. You have no one. You're just a sad little man counting his pennies in an empty house." I looked at her. I looked at the woman I had once thought I would grow old with. And I felt nothing. The emotional line item had been written off. "I'd rather be alone in an empty house than together in a cell," I said. I hung up the phone. I stood up and walked away. I didn't look back. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. It was uncontested. She had no leverage, no assets, and bigger problems to deal with. She and Brian were sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. I kept the house for a while, but eventually, I sold it. Too many ghosts. I bought a condo in the city, closer to work. A smaller place. Minimalist. Clean lines. No hiding spots. I was promoted to senior partner at my firm. My diligence was rewarded. My clients trusted me. If he can catch fraud in his own home, they joked nervously, he can certainly catch it in our books. I became a legend of sorts. The auditor. The man who couldn't be fooled. But sometimes, when it rains, when the sky turns that specific shade of charcoal gray and the wind howls against the glass of my high-rise apartment, I think about that night in the parking lot. I think about the choice I made standing in the rain. I could have opened the door. I could have screamed. I could have been human. Instead, I chose to be a machine. I sipped my whiskey, watching the rain streak the window, distorting the city lights into abstract blurs of color. The balance sheet was correct. The numbers didn't lie. But in the quiet of the night, in the absolute silence of my perfect, orderly life, I sometimes wondered if the cost of the audit had been higher than I calculated. I finished my drink. I washed the glass. I turned off the lights. Everything was in its place. The silence of the house in the weeks following the raid was not merely empty, it was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the furniture, the walls, and the very air I breathed. It was the density of 1,000 unspoken accusations, a vacuum left behind when the chaos finally receded. The media vans, which had camped out like vultures waiting for carrion, had finally retreated from the edge of my lawn, leaving behind deep, muddy tire tracks in the manicured grass like ugly scars on a perfect complexion. For a month, I had lived in the epicenter of a hurricane, the unblinking eye of a storm that was tearing Titan Real Estate apart while leaving me, the bewildered and grieving spouse, untouched in the center. I moved through the rooms like a ghost in my own life, observing the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, feeling the profound disconnect between the domestic setting and the corporate slaughter happening outside. I sat at my kitchen island, the granite cold and unforgiving under my fingertips. It was raining again, a gray, relentless drizzle that washed the color out of the suburban landscape, turning the world into a monochrome photograph. I was drinking tea. Coffee felt too aggressive, too jittery for the morning of a funeral, and that was essentially what today was. Not a funeral for a body, there would be no casket, no flowers, but a funeral for a marriage, for a decade of shared history that had turned out to be a forgery. Today was the deposition. Today was the first time I would see Jessica since the night the floodlights blinded her in the driveway of the Lake Forest estate, stripping away her dignity along with her freedom. My lawyer, James Sterling, had briefed me for hours the night before. James was a man who cost $700 an hour and was worth every penny. He wore suits that looked like they were woven from shadows and smoke, and he spoke in a voice that sounded like tearing parchment, dry, sharp, and expensive. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark that smelled blood in the water. "She will be desperate, Arthur," he had warned me, swirling a glass of scotch in my study, the amber liquid catching the low light. "Her defense team is drowning. The evidence the feds have is overwhelming. The paper trail you helped illuminate is a noose they can't slip. They need a lifeline. They need you to be the character witness who paints her as a victim of Brian's manipulation, a naive woman led astray. They need the loyal husband standing by his besieged wife." The loyal husband, I repeated, tasting the irony. It was bitter on my tongue. "Is that the role?" "That is the role," James said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "Until we get into that room. Then, we pivot. We lure them in with the promise of support, and then we shut the door." I checked my watch. 8:15 a.m. The meeting was at 9 o'clock. I stood up and rinsed my cup, watching the water swirl down the drain. I went to the hall closet and put on my coat. I caught my reflection in the mirror near the door. I looked tired. Good. The bags under my eyes were a prop, a calculated testament to my suffering. I adjusted my tie, a somber dark blue silk. It conveyed sadness, stability, and authority. It was the uniform of the grieving survivor. The drive to the city was slow, a funeral procession of one. I navigated the morning traffic with mechanical precision, my mind replaying the events of the last month like a film reel. The freezing of the assets. The public statements issued through trembling lips. The pitying looks from neighbors who brought casseroles and whispered condolences, casseroles I threw directly into the trash the moment the door closed. They looked at me and saw a cuckold, a fool who had been blind to his wife's criminal empire. They didn't know that the fool was the one pulling the strings, that the puppet master was sitting right in front of them, drinking their tea. I arrived at the law firm's building, a glass monolith piercing the gray sky in the financial district. The conference room was on the 30th floor, offering a view of the gray lake that matched my mood, turbulent, cold, and vast. James was already there, organizing a stack of files with surgical care, aligning the edges until they were perfectly flush. "Ready?" he asked, not looking up from his papers. "As I'll ever be," I said, taking the seat at the head of the table. The leather creaked, the only sound in the vast room. "Remember," James said, his eyes finally meeting mine, hard and devoid of warmth. "Emotion is a liability. Facts are assets. Stick to the assets. Do not engage with her tears. They are a weapon." The door opened at 9:05. Jessica entered first. She was unrecognizable from the woman who had sipped champagne in the Grand Salon a month ago, celebrating a theft she hadn't yet committed. She had lost weight, a lot of it. Her suit, usually tailored to perfection, hung loosely on her frame, emphasizing her frailty. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but strands were escaping, fraying at the edges like her composure. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark pits of exhaustion, rimmed with red. She looked like a building that had been gutted by fire, the facade still standing but the interior turned to ash. She was followed by her lawyer, a man named Hensley who had a reputation for being a bulldog but looked today more like a golden retriever that had been kicked. He carried the weariness of a man fighting a losing battle. And behind him, a junior associate trailed, carrying boxes of files that looked heavy with bad news. Jessica didn't look at me. She sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, staring at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. The distance between us was only 10 feet, but it felt like an ocean, a vast expanse of treacherous water filled with the wreckage of our past. "Let's begin," Hensley said, his voice blustery, trying to project a confidence I knew he didn't feel. He shuffled his papers nervously. We are here to discuss the preliminary terms of the marital asset separation in light of the pending criminal charges against my client. James leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table, a gesture of dominance. We are here to discuss Mr. Miller's protection from the fallout of your client's criminal enterprise, he corrected gently, his voice smooth as glass. Jessica flinched as if struck. Alleged enterprise, Hensley snapped, though the bite was weak. Jessica is a victim here. She was coerced. Manipulated by a senior partner who held power over her career. She is prepared to cooperate with the authorities, but she needs the support of her husband. We are asking for a deferment of the divorce proceedings until after the trial. A show of unity would go a long way in her plea bargaining. It could mean the difference between probation and prison. I looked at Jessica. She finally raised her eyes. They were wet, pleading, searching my face for a trace of the man she thought she knew. Arthur, she whispered. Please. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Or perhaps it was genuine terror. It didn't matter. The result was the same. She wanted me to anchor myself to her sinking ship. She wanted me to stand up in court and say, she is a good woman, she made a mistake, so that the judge might give her 5 years instead of 15. She wanted me to spend my social capital to buy her freedom. I can't do that, Jessica, I said. My voice was soft, sad, calibrated to sound regretful. Why not, she demanded, a flash of her old fire returning, sparked by panic. We've been married 10 years. Doesn't that mean anything? I made a mistake, Arthur. I got involved in something I couldn't control. Brian, he pressured me. He said it was standard practice. Brian pressured you to open shell companies in the Caymans? I asked, my voice remaining level. Did he pressure you to forge the escrow signatures? I saw the discovery files, Jess. Your signature is on the incorporation documents. Not Brian's. Yours. You were the architect of the financial structure, not the victim of it. Hensley intervened, raising a hand. Mr. Miller, let's not try the case here. The point is, if you abandon her now, you look vindictive. It hurts your image as much as hers. The public loves a forgiving husband. They love a redemption story. The public, James cut in, slicing through the rhetoric, admires a man of integrity who refuses to condone fraud. And frankly, Mr. Hensley, your client's financial situation is dire. All joint assets have been frozen. The government is looking to seize the house. Mr. Miller has managed to prove that his personal savings and his inheritance were kept separate and were not commingled with the illicit funds. We are petitioning to keep those assets distinct. We need access to those funds for her defense, Hensley said, slamming his hand on the table, the sound echoing in the room. You can't leave her defenseless. It's inhumane. I'm not leaving her defenseless, I said, meeting his gaze. I'm leaving her to the consequences of her own actions. Jessica stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh, grating sound. Consequences, she shouted, her voice cracking with hysteria. You talk about consequences? You sat there at breakfast that morning. You smiled at me. You poured my coffee. You told me to focus on the closing. You knew something was wrong, Arthur. I know you. You're too obsessive, too detail-oriented not to have noticed. Why didn't you stop me? Why did you let me walk off the cliff? The room went silent. The air was sucked out of the space. This was the moment. The pivot. Sit down, Jessica, Hensley hissed, touching her arm, trying to pull her back. She shook him off violently. No. I want to know. You act like this saint, this blind, innocent victim. But you're not. You're cold. You're a robot. You saw me struggling and you just watched. I looked at her. I looked at the desperation in her face. It was ugly. It was raw. It was the face of someone who realized the walls were closing in and there was no door, only mirrors reflecting her own ruin. I reached into my briefcase. The leather clasp clicked, a sound like a pistol hammer being cocked. I didn't just watch, Jessica, I said. I pulled out a manila envelope. It wasn't the one I had given to the IRS. This was my personal file. My insurance policy. I slid it across the polished wood of the table. It spun slowly, hissing as it moved, coming to a stop right in front of her. What is this? Hensley asked, reaching for it warily. It's for her, I said. Jessica stared at the envelope. Her hand trembled as she reached out. She opened the clasp with fumbling fingers. She pulled out the contents. It was a single photograph. The photo from the rainy night at the motel. The one taken through the window of the Lexus. Jessica, mouth open in sleep, head leaning back against the headrest. Brian, slumped against the glass. And in the foreground, illuminated by the flash I had suppressed but enhanced digitally later, the date and time stamp on the dashboard clock glowed in neon green. November 4th, 2:13 a.m. Jessica stared at the photo. Her breath hitched. She looked up at me, confusion warring with horror. The realization hit her in waves. "You were there," she whispered. "I was," I said. "But, that was weeks before the raid." "Yes. You followed me? You stood outside in the rain and took pictures?" "I audited you," I corrected, reclaiming the terminology of my profession. "I found the discrepancy. I verified it. And then I documented it." "You waited," she said, her voice rising in disbelief, trembling with the shock of betrayal. "You waited 3 weeks. You let me continue. You let me move the money. You let me plan the flight. You let me dig my own grave deeper every single day." "I needed the full scope," I said calmly. "If I had confronted you then, you would have denied it. You would have claimed it was a one-time error. You would have hidden the money better. You would have destroyed the evidence. I needed you to feel safe. I needed you to commit fully to the crime so that the evidence would be undeniable. I needed the account to be overdrawn beyond repair." "You set me up," she breathed. "You didn't just catch me. You farmed me. You grew the crime until it was big enough to bury me." "I mitigated my risk," I said. "And I secured my exit." Hensley was looking at the photo, then at me, with a look of dawning horror. He looked sick. "Mr. Miller, are you admitting that you knew about a federal crime and failed to report it immediately?" "On the contrary," James interjected smoothly, stepping in front of the bullet. "My client took the necessary time to gather concrete evidence to present to the authorities. He wanted to be certain before making such a damaging accusation against his wife. He acted with extreme diligence. The moment the evidence was irrefutable, he acted. It was a lie, of course. A legal fiction constructed to protect me. But a plausible one. And plausibility was all that mattered in this room." Jessica dropped the photo. It fluttered to the table like a dead leaf. She slumped back into her chair. The fight went out of her. She realized, finally, the magnitude of the trap she had walked into. She hadn't just been caught by the FBI. She had been herded there by her husband. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was barely audible. "Why didn't you just divorce me? Why destroy me?" "Because you broke the contract, Jessica," I said. I stood up, buttoning my jacket. I walked over to the window and looked out at the rain. "Marriage is a partnership. It's a merger of assets and liabilities. You tried to turn me into a liability. You tried to implicate me in your fraud. You used our joint credit cards. You used our address. You made me an accessory. You endangered my standing." I turned back to face her. "I don't accept liability for other people's errors. I corrected the balance sheet. You are the debt. I am the write-off." "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm solvent," I said. "And you are bankrupt?" I nodded to James. "I think we're done here. The settlement offer is on the table. She signs the uncontested divorce papers, granting me the house and full separation of assets, and I don't release the rest of the file to the press. The photos of you and Brian, intimate photos. The texts where you mock the judge. The emails where you discuss bribing city officials. I hadn't released those yet. I had kept them as leverage for this exact moment. The nuclear option. If those get out," I added, my voice low, "you won't get a plea deal. You'll get 20 years. You'll be an old woman when you get out." Hensley looked at Jessica. He was pale. He knew he had lost. He knew there was no defense against this. We'll consider the offer," Hensley stammered. "You have until 5 p.m., I said. I buttoned my coat. I walked toward the door. I didn't look at Jessica again. I didn't need to. I knew what she looked like. She looked like a column of numbers that had been crossed out in red ink. I walked out of the conference room and into the hallway. The air was cooler here. Cleaner. James followed me out. He was smiling, a small, tight smile of professional admiration. "That was effective," he said. "It was necessary," I replied. "You know," James said as we waited for the elevator, "most men would have broken. Most men would have yelled. Cried. You really are something else, Arthur." "I just like things to be tidy," I said. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. The ride down was swift. My ears popped. I walked out of the building and into the rain. I didn't open my umbrella. I let the water hit my face. It felt good. It felt like baptism. A washing away of the grime of the last 10 years. I walked to my car. I got in. I sat there for a moment, listening to the engine hum. My phone buzzed. It was a text from James. They signed. It's over. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. The knot in my chest, the one that had been there since that night in the motel parking lot, finally loosened. It was done. I put the car in gear and drove. I didn't go home. I didn't want to go to the empty house in the suburbs. Not yet. I drove to the lakefront. I parked and looked out at the water. The waves were gray and choppy, beating against the concrete wall with rhythmic violence. I thought about the future. I was 38 years old. I was single. My career was about to skyrocket. The tragic auditor narrative would play well for a few months, and then it would fade, replaced by the iron auditor reputation. I would be the man who couldn't be corrupted, the man who put ethics above everything, even his own heart. Clients would flock to me. They would want the man who turned in his own wife. They would think that if I could do that, I could certainly find the rot in their companies. I would be rich. I would be powerful. I would be alone. And that was fine. Solitude was predictable. Solitude didn't lie to you. Solitude didn't open offshore accounts behind your back. Solitude didn't whisper, "I love you," while stealing your future. I watched a seagull fighting against the wind. It hovered in place, suspended by the gale, going nowhere but refusing to fall. I was that bird. I started the car and turned toward the city. I had a lot of work to do. There were other files to review, other discrepancies to find. The world was full of chaos, full of people trying to hide their sins in columns and rows. And I was the one who would find them. I drove back into the grid, the lights of the skyscrapers guiding me home like a constellation of cold, electric stars. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. It was a quiet affair, handled by couriers and notaries. I didn't have to see her again. I sold the house in the suburbs. It sold quickly, the market was hot, and the notoriety of the Titan house added a morbid appeal for some buyers. I didn't care who bought it. I just wanted the equity. I wanted to liquidate the past. I moved into the city. I rented a temporary apartment while I looked for something permanent. Something high up. Something with glass walls. I received a letter from Jessica a month after she was sentenced. She got 12 years. Brian got 14. The letter was sent from the federal penitentiary. It was handwritten on lined paper. The handwriting was jagged, angry. "Arthur," it read. "I hope you're happy. I hope your perfect life keeps you warm at night. You think you won, but you lost the only real thing you ever had. We were happy once. Before the money. Before the lies. You destroyed that memory. You poisoned the past." I read it standing in my new kitchen. I read it twice. Then I shredded it. She was wrong. I hadn't poisoned the past. I had just corrected the record. We weren't happy. We were complacent. We were a fraudulent transaction waiting to be exposed. I poured myself a glass of water. I looked out at the city lights. I felt a vibration in my pocket. My work phone. It was late, but the firm never really slept. "Miller," I answered. "Arthur, it's the managing partner," the voice on the other end said. "We need to talk. The board is impressed. Very impressed. The way you handled the Titan situation, the integrity you showed. It's rare." "Thank you, sir. We're opening a new division. Forensic analysis. We want you to head it. Full autonomy. Name your price." I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the mechanical curvature of muscles responding to a calculated input. "I'll have a proposal on your desk by morning," I said. "Good man. Get some rest." I hung up. Rest? No, I wouldn't rest. I had a proposal to write. I had a division to build. A fortress of logic where emotions couldn't breach the walls. I sat down at my new desk. It was glass, transparent, revealing everything. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed, a blue square of infinite possibility. I created a new folder. Forensic Division, Strategic Plan. I began to type. The keys clicked. The city hummed. The world continued its chaotic, messy spin. And I sat in the center of it, the eye of the storm, perfectly still, perfectly alone, and perfectly in control. I was the net profit of my own life. And the bottom line looked very, very good.